The photograph in the old drawer. The dust in the bedroom danced in the late afternoon light, a slow, swirling suspension of the past. Michael Carter stood in the center of the room, a heavy cardboard box resting against his hip, listening to the quiet. It was the kind of quiet that only settled into a house after a long illness, a dense, hollow silence that meant the waiting was over. His mother, Evelyn, had been gone for 2 weeks. Now, in his late 30s, Michael found himself tasked with the strange, unmooring duty of dismantling the life of the woman who had built his own. Downstairs, the floorboards creaked. His younger sister, Anna, was in the kitchen, carefully wrapping the good china in newspaper. The rhythmic sound of tearing paper and the muffled clinking of porcelain were the only tethers Michael had to the present moment. Everything else in the room, the faint scent of lavender sachets, the meticulously ironed curtains, the polished oak of the bedroom furniture, belonged to Evelyn. Michael set the box down and approached the tall mahogany dresser that had dominated the corner of the room for as long as he could remember. It was a sturdy, imposing piece of furniture, much like his mother had been. Evelyn Carter was a woman of practicalities, a single mother who had raised 2 children with a fierce, unwavering competence. She had not been prone to outbursts of emotion or careless sentimentality. She kept the house in order, she paid the bills on time, and she rarely looked backward. He began to empty the bottom drawer, pulling out neatly folded wool sweaters. When the drawer was empty, he tried to push it shut, but it caught on something halfway. He jiggled it, but the wood groaned, stubbornly resisting. Clicking his tongue in mild frustration, Michael gripped the brass handles and pulled the heavy drawer entirely out of its tracks, setting it on the carpet. He knelt and shone the flashlight of his phone into the dark cavity of the dresser. There, wedged flat against the back panel where it must have slipped down years ago, was a faded, cream-colored envelope. Michael reached into the dusty hollow, his fingertips brushing against the dry wood until he caught the edge of the paper. He pulled it free. The envelope was unsealed, its edges soft and frayed with age. There was no name written on the outside. He blew the dust from its surface and opened the flap. Inside, wrapped in a piece of protective tissue paper, was a photograph. It was a Polaroid, its white border yellowed like old teeth, the colors muted by time but still remarkably clear. Michael stared at the image, his brow furrowing as his mind struggled to reconcile the woman in the picture with the mother he had just buried. It was Evelyn, but an Evelyn he had never seen. She looked to be in her late 20s. Her dark hair, which she had worn in a tight, sensible clip for the last 3 decades, was loose and windswept, blowing across her face. But it was her expression that arrested him. She was laughing. It wasn't a polite, restrained smile. It was a full, head-thrown-back laugh, her eyes crinkled with absolute, unguarded joy. She was standing on a wooden pier, the gray expanse of the ocean behind her. Standing beside her, with his arm wrapped comfortably around her waist, was a man. He was tall, wearing a faded denim jacket, with dark hair and a kind, slightly crooked smile. He was looking down at Evelyn with an expression of such profound tenderness that Michael felt a sudden, intrusive pang, as if he had just walked into a private room unannounced. Michael turned the photograph over. On the back, written in his mother's distinct, looping cursive, were a few words in blue ink: Evelyn and Thomas. Cape Elizabeth, September 1996. The day we almost left. 96. Michael did the math in his head. He would have been 8 years old. Anna would have been 5. Their father had passed away 2 years prior in a brief, sudden bout of illness. Michael's memory of that time was a blur of quiet, somber days and his mother's tired, resolute face. He had no memory of a man named Thomas. He had no memory of a trip to the coast. And he certainly had no memory of his mother ever looking that happy. "Anna?" Michael called out, his voice sounding entirely too loud in the stillness of the house. A moment later, footsteps climbed the stairs. Anna appeared in the doorway, a smudge of newspaper ink on her cheek, holding a roll of packing tape. "Did you find something?" she asked, catching the strange, distant look in her brother's eyes. Michael handed her the photograph. Anna took it, her eyes scanning the image. Her breath hitched slightly. Is this Mom? Read the back, Michael said softly. Anna turned it over. She read the words, her thumb tracing over the blue ink. She looked up at Michael, her expression a mirror of his own bewilderment. Who is Thomas? And what does she mean? The day we almost left. I don't know, Michael said, taking the photograph back. He looked at the man's face again. She never mentioned him. Not once. Not to me, anyway. She never mentioned anyone, Anna said, her voice tinged with a familiar, lingering ache. After Dad died, it was just us. She made sure of that. The house was a fortress. Anna looked at the dresser, then back at the photo. She kept this hidden. For 30 years. The afternoon sun shifted, stretching long, golden shadows across the floorboards, pulling the day toward evening. The discovery of the photograph hung between them, a heavy, unresolved cord. Michael realized, with a sudden, sharp clarity, that the mother they had mourned was only a fraction of the woman who had actually lived. I'm going to find out who he is, Michael said. Anna nodded slowly. She left an old leather address book in her desk downstairs, the one she kept by the rotary phone when we were kids. I didn't throw it out yet. They left the bedroom, the dust still settling behind them, and went to the small study off the living room. The leather book was sitting on top of a stack of utility bills. Its pages were brittle, filled with the names of plumbers, old neighbors, and distant relatives who had long since faded from their lives. Michael carefully turned the pages to the letter R. There, near the bottom of the page, written in faded pencil, was an entry. Thomas Reed, 42 Willow Creek Road, Oak Haven. Oak Haven was a small town about 2 hours north, nestled near the foothills. Michael stared at the address. It was just an hour's drive from where they stood. Do you think he's still there? Anna asked. Only one way to find out, Michael replied, slipping the address book into his jacket pocket. The next morning, the sky was a flat, unbroken sheet of gray clouds. Michael drove north, the rhythmic hum of the car tires over the asphalt blending with the low volume of the radio. The landscape outside his window shifted from the sprawling suburbs of his childhood to the dense, pine-crowded roads of the foothills. His mind drifted back to his mother. He remembered her hands, always busy, always capable. Folding laundry, packing lunches, pulling weeds from the garden. But he also remembered the quiet distance in her eyes, a barrier she had erected that neither he nor Anna had ever successfully crossed. He had always assumed it was the grief of losing their father. Now he wondered if it was something else entirely. Willow Creek Road was a winding, tree-lined street on the outskirts of Oak Haven. Number 42 was a modest, cedar-shingled house set far back from the road, surrounded by an overgrown but beautiful garden of ferns, hydrangeas, and trailing ivy. Beside the house stood a large, detached workshop with its double doors wide open, revealing the warm, amber glow of a bare bulb within. Michael parked on the gravel shoulder. The engine ticked as it cooled. He stepped out into the crisp, pine-scented air and walked slowly up the driveway, the gravel crunching loudly beneath his boots. From inside the workshop came the steady, rhythmic sound of sandpaper against wood. Michael stepped into the doorway. The air was thick with the rich, sweet smell of sawdust and linseed oil. At a heavy wooden workbench stood an older man, his back to the door. His hair was completely silver, thinning at the crown, and he wore a heavy canvas apron over a plaid shirt. "Hello," Michael said, his voice hesitant. The sanding stopped. The man slowly turned around, pulling a pair of protective goggles down to rest around his neck. He wiped his hands on a rag. His face was weathered, lined with the deep grooves of a life lived largely outdoors, but his eyes, kind, observant, and slightly questioning, were exactly the same as the ones in the 30-year-old Polaroid. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "Are you Thomas Reed?" Michael asked. "I am." Michael took a steadying breath. "My name is Michael Carter. Evelyn Carter was my mother." The rag slipped from Thomas's hands, falling softly to the sawdust-covered floor. For a long, agonizing moment. The older man simply stared at Michael, his breath caught in his chest. The silence in the workshop swelled, heavy and absolute. Thomas lifted a trembling hand to his mouth, his eyes searching Michael's face, tracing the lines of his jaw, the shape of his eyes. Was? Thomas whispered, the word barely escaping his lips. She passed away, Michael said gently. 2 weeks ago. Thomas reached out and gripped the edge of the workbench, as if the floor beneath him had suddenly tilted. He didn't speak. He just looked down at the rough-hewn wood in front of him, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. When he finally looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Come inside, Michael," he said quietly. They sat in the small, cluttered kitchen of the main house. A pot of coffee sat untouched between them on a worn oak table. The house was cozy, filled with hand-carved furniture and shelves heavy with books, but it held the distinct, undeniable atmosphere of a man who lived alone. Michael reached into his inner pocket, pulled out the protective tissue paper, and slid the Polaroid across the table. Thomas looked at it. A sad, fragile smile broke across his weathered face. He reached out and touched the image of Evelyn, his thick, callous thumb brushing lightly over her laughing face. "She kept it," he murmured, more to himself than to Michael. "All these years, she kept it." "I found it hidden in the back of her dresser," Michael said. "Thomas, who were you to her? She never spoke of you." Thomas leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in his lap. He looked toward the window, where the gray light filtered through the panes. "I was your neighbor," Thomas began, his voice soft, drifting back through the decades. "When your father passed, you were just a boy. Your mother, she was drowning, though she'd never admit it to a soul. I was a carpenter. I started coming over to fix things. A broken step, a leaking pipe. Things she didn't have the time or the money to deal with." He paused, a gentle fondness creeping into his tone. "At first, we were just friends. We'd sit on the back porch after you and Anna went to sleep, and we'd talk. She was so fierce, your mother, so determined to hold the world up on her own shoulders. But underneath all that armor, she was the warmest, most brilliant woman I had ever met." "You fell in love," Michael said, the pieces falling into place. "Deeply," Thomas said. "And she loved me too. For 2 years, we were quietly, wonderfully happy. That picture was taken on a weekend trip. We left you and Anna with your grandmother. It was the first time she had truly let herself breathe since your father died." The back of the photo says, "The day we almost left," Michael prompted. "What happened?" The light in Thomas's eyes dimmed, replaced by a profound, enduring sorrow. "I got a job offer in Oregon, a contract to help restore an old historic hotel. It was a massive opportunity, enough money to buy a proper house, to support her, to help raise you and your sister. I asked her to marry me. I asked her to pack up and come with me." Thomas looked down at his hands, tracing a scar across his knuckle. "She said yes. We had it all planned. We were supposed to leave on a Tuesday morning. I drove to your house in a rented moving truck. I stood on the porch, knocked on the door, and waited. The silence stretched in the kitchen, thick and agonizing. She never opened the door," Thomas said, his voice cracking slightly. "I stood there for an hour. I knew she was inside. I could see the shadow of her feet beneath the curtain of the front window. I called her name. I begged her to open the door, but she wouldn't." Michael frowned, a sudden ache blooming in his chest. "Why?" "Fear," Thomas said simply. "A few days before we were supposed to leave, she started to panic. She convinced herself that I was taking on too much, that raising another man's children would eventually breed resentment. She was terrified that if she leaned on me, if she truly gave herself over to our life together, the universe would snatch it away again, just like it did with your father. She thought she was protecting you. She thought she was protecting me. And you just left?" Michael asked, a hint of protective anger flaring for his mother. Thomas looked at him, his eyes completely vulnerable. "I thought her silence was an answer. I thought she had realized she didn't love me enough to take the leap. Pride is a terrible, foolish thing, Michael. My pride told me to walk away. Her pride wouldn't let her open the door and ask me to stay. Thomas stood up, walked over to a small wooden box on the kitchen counter, and returned to the table. He opened it and took out a letter. The envelope was sealed, yellowed, and heavily stamped with red ink. Return to sender. Refused. A year later, the anger faded, and the missing her became unbearable. Thomas said quietly, I wrote to her. I poured my heart out. I told her I would move back. I told her I didn't care about the job. I only cared about her. He slid the unopened letter across the table toward Michael. She sent it back. She didn't even open it. Michael stared at the red stamp. He knew his mother's rigid sense of honor, her punishing stoicism. He could see exactly what had happened. It wasn't that she didn't love Thomas. It was that she believed she had ruined things beyond repair. She had made her bed in the quiet, lonely fortress of her house, and she forced herself to lie in it, believing she no longer deserved the happiness she had thrown away. She built a wall around herself, Michael said, his voice thick with emotion as he finally understood the mother he had known. The distance, the strict routines. It was all a scaffolding to keep her from collapsing under the weight of her own regret. She kept us safe, Thomas, but she never let herself live again. Thomas wiped a single tear from his weathered cheek, nodding slowly. I loved her until the day she died, Michael. I just wish she had known that she was allowed to be forgiven. I think she did know, Michael said gently, tapping the Polaroid on the table. She hid this in a place where only she could find it. She kept you with her. The drive back south was entirely different from the drive north. The gray clouds broke, allowing long, fractured beams of evening sunlight to cut through the trees. Michael drove with the unopened letter resting on the passenger seat beside the photograph. He felt a strange lightness in his chest, an unraveling of the tight, unnamed knot he had carried since his mother's passing. When he finally pulled into the driveway of his childhood home, the porch light was on. Anna was sitting on the front steps, wrapped in one of their mother's old wool cardigans, waiting for him. Michael turned off the engine and sat in the quiet of the car for a moment. He looked up at the house. It no longer looked like a monument to a stoic, unknowable woman. It looked like the home of a human being, a deeply flawed, beautifully complex, fiercely loving woman who had made a heartbreaking mistake out of fear and had carried the weight of it in silence so her children wouldn't have to. He gathered the photo and the letter, stepped out of the car, and walked up the path to his sister. Anna stood up, searching his face. Did you find him? I did, Michael said. He reached out and wrapped his arm around his sister's shoulders, pulling her close. They stood there together on the porch, the cool evening air settling around them. Come inside. I want to tell you a story about Mom. They walked into the house, and Michael closed the door behind them. The oppressive silence that had choked the rooms for weeks was gone. In its place was something softer, something that felt like grace. Michael walked into the living room and gently placed the photograph of Evelyn and Thomas on the wooden mantelpiece, right in the center, where the light could finally catch her laughing face.